The drive to the dunes was long and monotonous, a blur of red rock and scrub brush under a blazing Arizona sun. Dr. Ethan Cross leaned back in the passenger seat, his research notes scattered across his lap, squinting at the horizon where heat shimmered like a mirage. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the SUV's straining air conditioning, and the leather seat stuck uncomfortably to his back. The papers on his lap were damp with perspiration, the ink beginning to blur at the edges. He'd spent months preparing for this expedition, poring over satellite imagery and geological surveys, but nothing in his research had prepared him for the oppressive weight of the desert air, an invisible force that seemed to press against his chest with each breath. The dashboard thermometer read 112 degrees, but it felt hotter, as if the very air was trying to bake them alive. Ancient petroglyphs they'd passed hours ago still lingered in Ethan's mind, crude drawings of spiraling shapes that looked unsettlingly like the aerial photos of their destination. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the data that had drawn them here. Unprecedented magnetic anomalies, unexplainable thermal patterns, and sand formations that defied every known model of dune migration. His fingers traced the edges of a particularly troubling graph, temperature variations that pulsed in regular intervals, like a heartbeat. 3 previous research teams had attempted to study the dunes. None had produced usable data, and their field notes had become increasingly erratic before communications simply stopped. The university had written it off as equipment failure and poor planning, but Ethan had seen the haunted looks in the eyes of the survivors when he'd interviewed them. One of them, a respected geologist with 30 years of field experience, had been reduced to drawing endless spirals in the margins of his notes, muttering about the rhythm of the sand. Ever heard of the breathing sands? Their guide, Sam Red Cloud, asked from the driver's seat. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel with practiced ease, but there was tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there when they'd started the journey. The shadows under his eyes seemed darker than they should be, even in the harsh desert light. A string of wooden beads hung from his rearview mirror, carved with symbols that matched the petroglyphs they'd seen earlier. They swayed gently, though the air conditioning vents weren't pointed in their direction. Ethan glanced at him, frowning. The afternoon sun cast deep shadows across Sam's face, highlighting the creases around his eyes, lines that spoke of decades spent in this unforgiving landscape. Some kind of local legend? Sam snorted, but there was no humor in the sound. His eyes flickered briefly to the rearview mirror, as if checking that something wasn't following them. More than a legend. The elders say the dunes breathe because they're alive. People who camp there hear it at night. A sound like someone exhaling, slow and deep. Some say it's the wind. Some say it's something else. His knuckles whitened on the wheel as he spoke, and his eyes never left the road, stretching endlessly before them. The silence that followed his words felt charged, like the air before a storm. He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "My great-grandfather was a guide too. Led a group of archaeologists out here in 1947. They found something in the sand, something old. They dug where they shouldn't have. After that," he shook his head. "The sand took them. All they found was their camp, everything untouched. No footprints leading away, no signs of struggle. Just smooth sand, like a fresh sheet pulled over a bed." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his scientific skepticism kicking in even as a chill ran down his spine despite the heat. He'd heard similar stories before. Every unusual geological formation seemed to have its own mythology. It's probably wind patterns interacting with the terrain. Sand dunes can resonate under the right conditions. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, too neat and clinical for the unease settling in his stomach. He'd read the papers on singing dunes, studied the physics behind their eerie sounds, but something about these formations was different. The satellite data showed patterns that shouldn't exist in nature, geometric precision that whispered of intelligence. Maybe, Sam's tone was nonchalant, but the tight grip on the steering wheel betrayed his unease. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, and his jaw clenched rhythmically. Years of guiding scientists through the desert had taught him to keep his opinions to himself, but something about these dunes made him break his usual silence. My grandfather used to say the sand remembers, that it holds on to things, people, memories, souls. He paused, then added almost inaudibly, and sometimes it gets hungry. The wooden beads swayed more violently now, though the SUV's movement couldn't account for their erratic dance. One of them had turned completely around, revealing a spiral pattern carved so deeply it seemed to move in the shifting light. In the back seat, Dr. Angela Moran, a climatologist with 15 years of field experience, flipped through a satellite map of the area. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her fingers traced the contours of the dunes with scientific precision. Coffee stains marked the corners of the maps, evidence of countless nights spent studying these impossible formations. The formations are highly unusual. Perfect symmetry like this is almost unheard of without human interference. The sand grain analysis shows compositions we've never seen before, and the thermal imaging... She trailed off, her scientific certainty wavering. She pulled out another map, this one marked with dates spanning the past 50 years. The dunes don't move like they should. Wind patterns, seasonal changes, nothing affects them. They're exactly the same as they were when the first aerial surveys were done in 1962. That's not just improbable, it's impossible. Her fingers traced a particular formation, and she frowned. And these temperature readings, they're like biological signatures, almost like, assuming the sands don't eat us first. Their intern Kyle muttered, earning a chuckle from the group that died too quickly in the stifling air. Fresh out of graduate school, Kyle had the eager energy of youth tempered by an unexpected perceptiveness. He'd been quiet most of the journey, watching the landscape with increasingly wary eyes. His tablet displayed a series of equations, wind velocity calculations, and particle distribution models, but none of them could explain what they were about to encounter. The screen of his tablet flickered, numbers shifting into impossible configurations before stabilizing again. He'd been monitoring the magnetometer readings since they'd entered the region, watching as the natural electromagnetic field of the Earth twisted into patterns that defied explanation. The closer they got to the dunes, the more erratic the readings became, pulsing in a rhythm that was disturbingly regular, almost like a heartbeat, but slower, deeper, more ancient. The mood lightened as the team's campsite came into view, a cluster of tents and equipment boxes nestled near the base of the largest dune. But as they drew closer, even Ethan had to admit there was something unsettling about the perfect curves of the sand formations. They looked almost engineered, their slopes too precise, their arrangement too intentional. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their faces, creating patterns that seemed to shift and change, even when the air was still. The dunes rose before them like the ribs of some ancient, buried creature, their crests cutting sharp lines against the cloudless sky. The equipment they'd shipped ahead sat untouched, exactly as the advance team had left it. But something was wrong. The sand around the cases was smooth, unnaturally so, as if it had been deliberately leveled. No footprints marred its surface, despite the fact that someone must have placed the equipment there. The wind picked up as they approached, carrying with it a sound just below the threshold of hearing, a vibration more felt than heard, like the subsonic rumble of distant machinery. Kyle was the first to notice the patterns, tiny spirals in the sand, perfect miniature replicas of the larger formations visible in their aerial photos. They appeared and disappeared as they watched, like ripples in water, but the wind wasn't strong enough to cause such movement. His hand shook as he photographed them, the camera's display showing strange artifacts, dark shapes at the edges of the frame that vanished when viewed directly. As they unloaded their gear, the sun began to set, painting the dunes in shades of blood and gold. The temperature dropped rapidly, but the air remained thick, oppressive. Their instruments came alive one by one, magnetometers spinning wildly, seismographs recording impossible readings. The sand beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an energy that set their teeth on edge. Angela's atmospheric sensors registered pressure changes that followed no natural pattern, rising and falling in slow, rhythmic waves. The air itself seemed to grow thicker as darkness fell, becoming almost viscous, resistant to movement. Sound behaved strangely too, voices becoming muffled and distorted, as if traveling through something more substantial than air. Night fell quickly in the desert, bringing with it a silence so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums. The stars appeared, impossibly bright, but they seemed wrong somehow, as if the very sky had shifted when they weren't looking. The constellations were subtly distorted, forming new patterns that drew the eye into spiraling configurations that echoed the shapes in the sand below. The team huddled around their equipment, taking readings that made no sense, recording data that contradicted everything they thought they knew about desert formations. The sand around their boots had begun to move, forming tiny eddies and currents that flowed against the light wind. Equipment failures cascaded through their carefully arranged monitoring stations, batteries dying despite being fully charged, digital displays showing impossible readings before going dark. And then they heard it. A sound like breath escaping from enormous lungs, deep and resonant, echoing across the dunes. The sand beneath their feet vibrated in perfect rhythm with the sound, and for a moment, just a moment, Ethan could have sworn he saw the entire dune rise and fall like a sleeping giant's chest. The movement was almost imperceptible, but the instruments caught it, a displacement of millions of tons of sand, moving in perfect synchronization. The night wore on, and the breathing grew louder. Equipment malfunctioned, batteries died inexplicably, and the sand began to move. Not with the wind. There was no wind now, but with a purpose of its own. Tiny rivulets formed patterns at their feet, complex spirals that mimicked the ones in their aerial photographs. The temperature continued to drop, but the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. Sam stood at the edge of their camp, his wooden beads clutched tightly in one hand. He was chanting something under his breath, words in a language Ethan didn't recognize. The beads clicked together in rhythm with the breathing of the dunes, and the spirals in the sand seemed to respond, growing more complex, more deliberate. In the darkness, Sam's words echoed in Ethan's mind. Sometimes it gets hungry. The team retreated to their tents, but sleep was impossible. The breathing sound surrounded them, accompanied now by something else. A whispering just beyond the range of comprehension. Words in a language too old for human tongues. Their satellite phones showed no signal, though they'd worked perfectly hours before. The GPS coordinates jumped erratically, as if they were somehow in many places at once. Kyle's tablet was the last piece of equipment still functioning. The screen displayed an endlessly repeating pattern of numbers, coordinates that matched the location of every previous disappearance in the dunes. As they watched, the numbers began to shift, forming new coordinates, their current location. The tablet's camera activated on its own, showing nothing but darkness. But in that darkness, something moved. Dawn should have come, but the darkness lingered. The stars had disappeared, though no clouds obscured the sky. One by one, their lights flickered and died, leaving them in a darkness so complete it seemed solid. And in that darkness, the sand moved. They could hear it shifting, millions of grains moving in concert, forming shapes they could feel but not see. The air grew thick with it, each breath drawing in particles of ancient sand that seemed to burn in their lungs. The breathing sound was all around them now, not just from the dunes, but from the very air itself. Angela's blood ran cold as her phone crackled to life, static giving way to a sound that might have been voices, might have been screams, before resolving into a single clear signal. Ethan, where are you? Her voice trembled in the oppressive dark, barely audible over the sound of shifting sand. There was a long pause before she whispered, "It's here." Her voice cracked with terror as the line went dead, leaving only the sound of static, and beneath it, something that might have been breathing. The darkness seemed to pulse around her, and the sand was rising, taking shape, reaching with fingers of ancient earth towards something it had waited millennia to claim. In his office, months later, surrounded by research papers and artifacts from the expedition, Ethan stared at the silent phone. Through his window, he could see the distant mountains silhouetted against the setting sun. And for a moment, he could have sworn the shadows moved like waves of sand, breathing in perfect, terrible rhythm. The papers on his desk shifted in a non-existent breeze, and in the corner of his eye, he saw tiny spirals forming in the dust on his windowsill, patterns he recognized from those impossible dunes. The air grew thick, and somewhere, just at the edge of hearing, something took a deep, hungry breath. His phone buzzed once, displaying coordinates he recognized, the exact location of the dunes. The screen filled with static, then darkness, but not before he saw it. A perfect spiral of sand, forming on his desk, beginning to turn, to rise, to reach. And in the silence of his office, he heard it breathing. The cabin was smaller than Anna remembered, tucked away in a thicket of ancient pine trees at the edge of the reservation. Their branches intertwined overhead like gnarled fingers, creating shifting patterns of shadow and light on the forest floor. The air smelled like damp earth and cedar, tinged with the metallic hint of approaching rain, and the world felt quieter here, insulated from the persistent hum of city life by layers of silence that seemed to press against her eardrums. She stepped out of her truck, the door's creak echoing unnaturally in the stillness. Squinting at the weathered wood of the cabin, she took in every detail of its decay. It had been 7 years since she last visited, and time hadn't been kind. The shutters hung crooked on rusted hinges, creaking softly in the breeze, and thick, dark moss crept up the foundation, like a slow-moving tide, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim the structure. Paint peeled from the walls in long, curling strips that reminded her of shed snakeskin. "Home for the summer," she muttered to herself, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Her voice sounded foreign in this place, too sharp against the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. Her grandfather had left it to her in his will, a gesture that felt more like an apology than an inheritance. The envelope containing the deed had arrived 3 weeks after the funeral she hadn't attended, accompanied by a brief note written in his shaky hand. "It's yours now. Use it wisely." She hadn't been close to him, their relationship strained to breaking after her parents' divorce. The weekly visits of her childhood had dwindled to awkward holiday phone calls, then to nothing at all. Still, with no job and nowhere else to go after the layoffs at the firm, she figured she'd spend the summer here. Maybe it would help her reconnect with her roots, or at least provide the peace and quiet she needed to clear her head of the city's constant noise. The locals were polite but distant, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes when she mentioned where she was staying. At the general store, the cashier, a wiry man in his 60s with hands spotted by age and sun, hesitated when she mentioned the cabin, his weathered face tightening almost imperceptibly. "You're his granddaughter, huh?" he said, scanning her groceries with deliberate slowness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his features. Anna nodded, tossing a bag of rice onto the counter. The thud seemed too loud in the empty store. "Yeah, figured I'd clean the place up, maybe stay a while. Get my head straight." He handed her the receipt, his expression unreadable behind deep-set eyes that had seen too many winters. His calloused fingers brushed against hers, cold as stone. "Be careful out there. And don't go past the cedar markers." "Cedar markers?" The paper crinkled in her grip. "You'll see them. Twisted branches tied with red thread. They're there for a reason." His voice carried the weight of generations, heavy with unspoken warnings. Before she could ask more, he turned to help the next customer, effectively dismissing her with a gesture that seemed practiced, almost ritual. Anna dismissed the warning as local superstition until she saw the markers for herself, their presence impossible to ignore in the fading daylight. They lined the edge of the property like silent sentinels, spindly cedar branches twisted into strange shapes that hurt her eyes if she looked at them too long. Their knots were secured with frayed red thread that seemed to pulse faintly in the dying light, like capillaries beneath pale skin. They swayed slightly in the breeze, as if alive, though the air was still enough to make her doubt her senses. The markers formed a perfect boundary around the cabin, their placement too precise to be random. She felt a twinge of unease crawl up her spine, but forced herself to shake it off. She'd grown up in the city, far removed from her culture's traditions, surrounded by steel and concrete instead of wood and earth. It was probably just a custom she didn't understand, a remnant of beliefs that had no place in her modern worldview. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed that still smelled faintly of her grandfather's pipe tobacco, she heard the first howl. It started faint, a low, mournful sound that rose and fell like a distant wind. But there was something wrong about it, something that made her skin prickle with ancient recognition. Anna sat up, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Coyotes, she thought desperately, though the sound was deeper, more resonant, carrying harmonics that no natural creature should be able to produce. She tried to ignore it, pulling the musty quilts up to her chin, but as the night stretched on like taffy, the howling grew louder, closer, until it seemed to echo just outside her window. The sound carried emotions she couldn't name, a mixture of hunger and sorrow that made her throat tight with unshed tears. The next morning, Anna asked her nearest neighbor, a woman named Clara, who lived in a small house half a mile down the dirt road, about the sound. Clara's kitchen smelled of sage and sweetgrass, and her eyes held a wisdom that made Anna feel like a child again. "Could be wolves," Clara said, frowning as she poured tea into chipped ceramic mugs. Steam rose between them like spirits. "But I doubt it." "Why?" Anna wrapped her hands around the warm cup, seeking comfort in its heat. Clara hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn tablecloth. "Some say it's the Yilku." Anna raised an eyebrow, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's that?" "A predator," Clara said carefully, each word measured like medicine. "It's drawn to guilt, regret. My mother told me stories about it when I was a girl. Said it hunts those who carry a heavy heart." She paused, studying Anna's face. "Said it doesn't stop until it's satisfied." Anna forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Well, I guess I'd better keep my conscience clear." But Clara didn't laugh. Her eyes were dark with knowledge she seemed reluctant to share. That night, Anna heard the howling again, and this time it brought company. It started the same, low and mournful, but this time it was accompanied by a soft tapping on her window, like bone against glass. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, muscles locked in primal fear. The tapping came again, deliberate and rhythmic, a pattern that seemed almost like language. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run, she turned her head. Outside the glass, barely visible in the silver moonlight that filtered through the pines, was a pale figure. It crouched unnaturally low, its limbs too long and jointed in ways that defied anatomy. Its head tilted at an angle that made her neck ache in sympathy. Its skin was the color of old bone, stretched too tight over its frame. Anna's stomach dropped as if the floor had disappeared beneath her. The figure raised a hand, its fingers impossibly thin and tipped with shadows darker than the night, and tapped once more. Its eyes were hollow pools that seemed to drink in what little light remained. Her scream broke the silence like shattering glass, and the figure vanished into the night, leaving only the impression of its wrongness burned into her vision. The next day, Anna found herself searching for answers, desperate to understand what she'd seen. She dug through her grandfather's belongings, hoping for some clue to explain the horror that stalked the property's edge. In a dusty chest beneath his bed, covered in layers of old blankets that smelled of mothballs and memory, she found a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with detailed sketches of the cedar markers, along with notes written in increasingly shaky handwriting that spoke of growing fear. "The Yilku feeds on guilt," one passage read. "It is patient, persistent. Once it finds you, it won't stop until you atone. The markers help, but they're not enough. Not anymore." Anna's hands trembled as she turned the yellowed pages, each entry more desperate than the last. The final entry, dated just weeks before his death, read, "I crossed the boundary, and now it's my burden to bear. I can only hope the markers will keep it at bay. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Her heart raced as understanding dawned. She had crossed the boundary on her first day, wandering past the cedar markers to explore the woods, dismissing their importance. Had she disturbed something ancient, something that had been waiting for another chance to feed? Over the next week, the hauntings intensified with frightening speed. The howling came every night, closer and louder, carrying hints of words just beyond her understanding. Shadows flickered in the corners of her vision, taking shapes that disappeared when she tried to focus on them. The cabin's air grew colder, heavier, as if something unseen was slowly filling the space. Once, she woke to find red thread tied around her wrist, the knot too intricate for human hands to have crafted in sleep. It pulsed faintly against her skin, warm and alive. The final straw came when she found claw marks gouged into her front door. Deep, deliberate scratches that hadn't been there the day before, arranged in patterns that made her dizzy when she looked at them too long. Desperate, Anna returned to Clara, recounting everything with shaking hands and a voice that cracked with fear. Clara's face was pale as she listened, her eyes wide with recognition. "You need to make amends," she said, gripping Anna's hands tight enough to hurt. "For what?" Anna's voice was barely a whisper. "For whatever you've done to draw its attention. The Yilku doesn't hunt randomly. It's tied to you now, bound by blood and guilt." Anna racked her brain for answers, for some sin great enough to warrant this haunting. Her thoughts turned to her grandfather, to the guilt that had kept her from his funeral. What had he done to invoke the creature? Had it been waiting for her all along, tied to her family by bonds thicker than blood? She returned to the cedar markers, hoping for clarity in the fading daylight. As she approached the boundary, the air grew colder, and a foul smell filled her nostrils. Decay and regret made manifest. In the distance, she saw it. The pale figure, crouched low among the trees, its hollow eyes fixed on her with terrible patience. It didn't move, but she could feel its hunger, its anger, its ancient need for balance. "Leave me alone," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, hot against her cold skin. The figure tilted its head, as if mocking her pain, its neck bending at an impossible angle. That night, Anna made a decision born of desperation and understanding. She gathered the fallen cedar markers and rebuilt the boundary, her hands bleeding as she tied the red thread tightly around each branch. As she worked, the howling surrounded her, unrelenting, a chorus of voices that spoke of guilt and redemption. When she finished, she stood at the edge of the property, clutching her grandfather's journal to her chest like a shield. "I'm sorry," she said aloud, her voice shaking, but growing stronger with each word. "For whatever he did, for whatever I've done, for the years of silence, for the funeral I missed, for every moment I chose anger over forgiveness. Please, let me go." The howling stopped. For a moment, the forest was silent, holding its breath. Then, slowly, the pale figure stepped back into the shadows, its form dissolving like mist, disappearing into the trees that seemed to bend away from its passage. In the days that followed, the howling ceased. The cabin felt lighter, the air warmer, though the cedar markers still swayed in non-existent winds. But Anna couldn't shake the feeling that the Yilku was still watching, waiting in the spaces between trees for another transgression, another debt to collect. Before she left the cabin at the end of the summer, she placed the journal on the mantel and whispered a prayer in a language she hadn't used since childhood. The words felt right on her tongue, ancient and true. Some burdens, she realized, could never be fully lifted. They could only be acknowledged, accepted, and carried with grace until the next generation came to claim them. As she drove away, she caught a glimpse of something pale moving among the trees in her rearview mirror. But this time, she didn't look back. The drive into the Clearwater Reserve was beautiful, even if Sam Thorne didn't particularly care for the wilderness. The forest stretched endlessly on either side of the gravel road, its dense canopy casting long shadows in the early morning light. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches interwoven so tightly they created a natural tunnel that seemed to swallow his truck whole. The crisp autumn air carried the musty scent of decomposing leaves and damp earth, a reminder that winter wasn't far off. "You'll be the only ranger assigned to this part of the reserve," his supervisor had said during the briefing, fingers drumming nervously on his worn oak desk. "It's remote, but the wildlife's worth protecting. Just keep an eye on the elk herd. They've been acting strange." The hesitation in his supervisor's voice had been subtle but unmistakable, like someone choosing their words too carefully. "Strange how?" Sam had asked, watching his supervisor's weathered face for any hint of real concern. His supervisor's answer had been vague. Unusual movements, a few unexplained deaths, nothing he hadn't seen before. But the way the older man's eyes had darted away, focusing on the wall of certificates behind Sam's head, suggested otherwise. Now, as he pulled up to the small ranger station nestled among the trees, he wondered if he should have asked more questions. The station itself was a testament to isolation, a weathered log cabin with peeling green trim, its windows reflecting the dense forest that pressed in from all sides. A thin spiral of smoke rose from the stone chimney, evidence that someone had prepared for his arrival by starting a fire in the old wood stove inside. The first few days passed uneventfully, though each sunset seemed to bring an increasing sense of unease. Sam familiarized himself with the trails, marking their serpentine paths on his topographical maps, and noting the places where human footprints gave way to animal tracks. He set up motion-activated cameras near known elk migration paths, their electronic eyes blinking red in the growing darkness. The herd was smaller than expected, numbering perhaps 30 instead of the 100 documented in previous surveys, and their movements were erratic. They'd appear in one location, only to vanish completely, reappearing miles away without leaving tracks between points. But nothing suggested immediate danger, at least not yet. That changed on the fourth day. He was patrolling a section of forest known as Elk Hollow, where the trees thinned out to reveal a natural depression in the earth, when he found the first carcass. The morning fog still clung to the ground, wreathing the scene in an ethereal haze that made everything seem slightly unreal. The elk had been mutilated, its stomach torn open, its entrails scattered across the frost-covered ground like discarded rope. The blood had soaked into the earth, turning it black. But something about the pattern was wrong. It radiated outward in perfect circles, as though the animal had been placed there after death. But what caught Sam's attention were the antlers. They'd been hollowed out, the inside scooped clean like the core of an apple. The bone was smooth, almost polished, and completely empty of the dense material that should have filled it. "What the hell?" he muttered, crouching to examine them. His breath frosted in the air as he leaned closer, and he could have sworn the temperature dropped several degrees. The hollow antlers seemed to absorb the weak sunlight rather than reflect it, creating tiny black holes in the morning light. There were no tracks around the body, no signs of predators or scavengers. The ground was undisturbed except for the blood circles, as though the elk had materialized there or dropped from the sky. Just the hollow antlers, gleaming faintly in the sunlight, with an almost metallic sheen that bone should never possess. That evening, Sam reported the incident to his supervisor via satellite phone, the only reliable form of communication in the remote location. The connection crackled with static that seemed to grow worse whenever he mentioned the antlers. His supervisor promised to send a biologist, though his voice carried an undertone of resignation, as though he'd expected this call. "Could be poachers," the supervisor suggested, but the words rang hollow. Sam doubted it. The carcass hadn't been stripped for meat, and the antlers weren't missing. They'd been altered. The work was too precise, too deliberate for any tool he'd ever seen. As he logged the day's events in the station's worn, leather-bound incident book, he noticed a necklace of beads and feathers hanging from a nearby branch. It hadn't been there before. He was certain of that. The beads were made of bone, smooth and white, like the hollowed antlers, and the feathers were crow-black, with tips dipped in what looked uncomfortably like dried blood. "What now?" he muttered, stepping closer. The evening wind had died completely, leaving the forest unnaturally still. The necklace was simple, but something about it felt deliberate, almost like a message left in a language he couldn't quite read. Each bead had been carved with tiny symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly. He made a note to ask around, assuming it was a tribal marker left by local hunters, though deep down, he knew no hunter would leave something so unsettling. The next morning, Sam met Marla Whitefeather, a tribal leader from the reservation bordering the forest. Her face was lined with age and wisdom, but her eyes held a sharp intelligence that made him uncomfortable. She listened quietly as he described the necklace and the carcass, her expression growing more grave with each detail. "You should have left the antlers alone," she said when he finished, her voice carrying the weight of generations of warning. Sam blinked, caught off guard by her directness. "What are you talking about?" The antlers were a warning, a way to signal the Manitou to stay dormant. Each hollow space is a seal, a boundary between our world and its domain. Her fingers traced invisible patterns in the air as she spoke. He stifled a laugh, though it came out more nervous than dismissive. "You don't really believe that, do you?" Marla's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Believe what you want. But if you've disturbed the balance, you need to fix it. Quickly. The Manitou doesn't forgive, and it never forgets a face it's seen." Sam dismissed her warning as superstition, though he couldn't shake the feeling that her words carried more truth than he wanted to admit. That night, he woke to the sound of something moving outside his cabin. The noise wasn't the familiar rustle of nocturnal animals, but something heavier, more deliberate. The floorboards beneath his bed vibrated with each movement, and the air inside the cabin grew thick with an organic, musty smell. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The forest was silent, save for the creak of wood under his boots and a low, rhythmic sound that might have been breathing, if whatever made it had lungs the size of oil drums. Then he saw them. A line of elk stood at the edge of the tree line, their forms unnaturally still in the darkness, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like mirrors. But something was wrong with the reflection. It showed scenes that couldn't exist, glimpses of places that shouldn't be real. They didn't move, didn't graze, just stared with an intelligence that no animal should possess. Sam's chest tightened as cold sweat soaked through his shirt. The light from his flashlight illuminated their faces, and his breath caught in his throat, Their eyes weren't just reflective. They were hollow black pits that seemed to absorb the light, identical to the hollowed antlers he'd found. Behind them, shadows moved in ways that ignored the moon's position, and the air itself seemed to bend and twist. He stumbled back inside and locked the door, though the rational part of his mind screamed that no lock would stop whatever was out there. The elk's hollow eyes had held recognition. They knew him now. The next morning, Sam found deep gouges in the porch railing, as though something had scraped against it during the night. The marks were too precise to be random, forming patterns similar to the symbols on the bone beads. The wood around them had turned black and felt cold to the touch, like flesh with severe frostbite. Wolves, he muttered, though he didn't believe it. Wolves didn't leave marks that seemed to pulse faintly in daylight, and they certainly didn't carve symbols that hurt your eyes if you looked at them too long. As he patrolled the forest, he found more necklaces tied to branches, each one different, but equally unsettling. Some were made of bone and feather, others of hair and teeth that looked disturbingly human. The air felt heavier, pressing against his skin like a physical weight, and the usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, were eerily absent, as though every living thing was holding its breath. That afternoon, he found a second elk carcass. This one was worse. The body was contorted, its legs twisted at unnatural angles that suggested its bones had been liquefied and reformed. The antlers were missing entirely, leaving jagged stumps where they'd been sawn off. The cutting edges were too smooth for any tool, almost cauterized, as though they'd been removed by something burning hot or impossibly cold. A foul smell hung in the air, sharp and metallic, like blood mixed with ozone. Small shadows darted between the trees, moving independently of any physical objects, and the ground around the carcass was covered in frost despite the afternoon heat. Sam's radio crackled to life, making him jump. Through the static, he heard Marla's voice, her tone urgent. "You need to leave. Now." "How do you know where I am?" he demanded, spinning in place as the shadows continued their impossible dance. "I can feel it," she replied, her voice growing distorted. "You've been marked. The hollow places. They're spreading." Sam tried to leave that night, his hands shaking so badly he could barely pack. He threw his gear into his truck and started the engine, but when he tried to navigate out of the reserve, the GPS refused to work. Every route led him back to the same spot, the clearing where he'd found the first carcass. The truck's electronics flickered and died, and the air inside the cabin grew cold enough to freeze his breath. Frustrated and terrified, he turned the truck off and stepped into the clearing. The moon cast everything in silver light, except for the shadows, which seemed to drink in the brightness and grow darker. The hollow antlers were there, resting on the ground where he'd left them. But now, they seemed larger, darker, as though they'd grown overnight. Their surface rippled like liquid, despite being solid bone, and the hollow spaces seemed to go on forever, suggesting geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. A low growl rumbled through the clearing, but it wasn't coming from any single direction. It emanated from the ground itself, from the air, from the hollow spaces that were spreading like cancer through the forest. Sam spun around, flashlight shaking, its beam seeming weak and insignificant against the growing darkness. The elk stood in a semicircle at the edge of the trees, their hollow eyes fixed on him. But they weren't entirely elk anymore. Their forms shifted and flowed, antlers sprouting and withering in seconds, legs bending at impossible angles. The hollow spaces in their eyes had spread, turning their entire heads into voids that hurt to look at. He backed away, the antlers crunching underfoot like brittle ice. The growl grew louder, and the elk took a step forward in unison, moving with a terrible synchronization that suggested they were all controlled by a single mind. "Okay," Sam muttered, raising his hands in submission. "I get it. I'll leave." but the growling didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, and now he could hear words in it, ancient, twisted sounds that human vocal cords could never produce. The hollow spaces were spreading faster now, consuming the elk from inside out, turning them into windows, into something vast and hungry and patient. Desperate, Sam called Marla, who agreed to meet him at the station. Each minute of waiting felt like an eternity as the shadows pressed closer and the air grew colder. She arrived just before dawn, carrying a bundle of dried herbs that smelled of sage and something older, earthier, and a small drum decorated with symbols that matched the ones carved into the porch. "You've angered the Manitou," she said bluntly, her eyes reflecting the same hollow darkness he'd seen in the elk. "We need to make an offering." "What kind of offering?" His voice cracked with fear. She didn't answer directly, instead leading him to the clearing where it had all started. The antlers were gone, seemingly absorbed into the earth. In their place was a mound of dirt, freshly disturbed, though no animal or tool had moved it. "Dig," Marla instructed, handing him a spade that seemed to vibrate with its own energy. Sam hesitated, but obeyed, each shovelful of earth feeling heavier than it should. After a few minutes, his spade struck something hard that rang like a bell, the sound echoing far longer than natural acoustics should allow. He unearthed an old, weathered mask, its surface carved with symbols similar to those on the necklaces. The mask was made of bone, or something like it, and the hollow spaces within its eyes and mouth seemed to connect to the same vast nothingness he'd seen in the elk. Marla knelt beside him, placing the herbs on the mask and lighting them with a match. The smoke that rose was too dark, too substantial, moving against the wind in spirals that formed familiar symbols before dissolving. She began to drum softly, chanting words in a language that made Sam's ears ache and his vision blur. The forest seemed to exhale, a great release of tension he hadn't even realized was building. The air lightened as the smoke rose, and the hollow spaces retreated slightly, like a predator taking a step back but not leaving entirely. When Marla finished, she turned to Sam, her eyes now normal but filled with something like pity. "The Manitou is a guardian of hollow places, of spaces between spaces. You disturbed it, but this should calm it, for now." "For now?" The words caught in his throat. She gave him a long look that suggested she was seeing more than just his physical form. "You can't unmark yourself. It knows you now. The hollow places have seen your face, and they never forget." Sam stayed in the reserve for another week, though each night brought dreams of vast, empty spaces and eyes that contained universes of darkness. The elk no longer appeared outside his cabin, but he could feel them watching from the shadows that grew longer each day. The gouges on the porch faded, as though the wood had healed itself, but the symbols were still visible if you knew where to look and weren't afraid to let your eyes unfocus slightly. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hollow places were spreading, slower now, but unstoppable. He saw them in his coffee cup in the morning, in his reflection in the window, in the spaces between his fingers when he held them up to the light. On his final patrol, he found one last necklace tied to a tree near the clearing. This one was different, made of human hair and bones, that he suspected might have once been his own, in some future that was now unavoidable. The hollow spaces within the bones seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. He left it untouched, understanding finally that it wasn't a warning, but a promise. When he left Clearwater Reserve, he swore he heard a low growl in the distance, a reminder that distance meant nothing to the hollow places. In his rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of antlers that contained universes, of eyes that had never been meant for sight. Somewhere, the Manitou was still watching, patient and eternal, waiting for him to find his own hollow places. And in time, he knew. He would.